Alaska's Senate ballot this November will list two men named Dan Sullivan, and one of them is the sitting senator. Lambert Woollingham here, and this is the Daily Shear for Wednesday, August 26th, 2026. I read today's stories in the order they arrived, which is more discipline than most of the people in them showed. Closer to home, Texas spent the day settling one old account and quietly opening several new ones. Fort Worth City Council voted unanimously to finalize an $11.25 million civil rights settlement, with the family of Atatiana Jefferson closing out all claims tied to her fatal 2019 shooting by then-officer Aaron Dean. The vote comes just weeks after the same council approved an additional $100,000 to cover Dean's own legal fees. He is currently 11 years into a manslaughter sentence. This latest payout follows a $3.5 million settlement reached last year with Jefferson's nephew, who was 8 years old, and in the room when Dean fired through the window. Council members told Tuesday's meeting that the money cannot substitute for justice, which is true, and residents asked the city to make sure it does not have to write this kind of check again. Pflugerville's City Council voted unanimously to terminate its $87,500 annual contract with Flock Safety, and ordered all 32 of the city's automated license plate readers covered immediately. The cancellation followed a resident's public records request showing outside law enforcement agencies had searched the city's camera data nearly 1.6 million times over 6 months, despite settings specifically configured to block statewide and national sharing. A follow-up staff investigation confirmed the system was set up correctly to prevent that access and shared the data anyway. Police Chief Willie Richards withdrew his own recommendation to renew the lease, citing a total loss of confidence in the vendor. The settings worked exactly as designed, which turned out to be the problem. Fort Worth's council also approved a revised site plan for Black Mountain's $10 billion data center campus in the southeast part of the city after months of neighborhood pushback and 2 prior tabblings since May. The new 187-acre blueprint cuts the number of buildings from 18 down to 4 and halves the total ground coverage in exchange for raising the maximum building height to 70 feet. The developer agreed to a mandatory 300-foot buffer of retained trees and green space between the facility and nearby homes. The 7-4 vote also cleared an on-site electrical substation to power the complex. Fewer buildings, taller buildings, and now their own power plant. A federal judge handed down a permanent injunction against Texas Senate Bill 12 for the second time, again finding that the state's attempt to restrict public drag performances violates the First Amendment. United States District Judge David Hittner ruled the law unconstitutionally vague, noting its definition of prurient interest was loose enough to sweep in athletes, comedians, and celebrity impersonators along with its actual targets. The ruling reaffirms Hittner's original 2023 decision, which an appeals court had paused in March to let the law take effect during further review. Violators faced up to a year in jail, and businesses hosting banned shows risked $10,000 fines. Attorney General Ken Paxton has already promised to appeal a ruling he has now lost twice. Turning to the economy, the day's numbers ranged from a rent-fixing settlement to a Treasury Secretary buying his own government's bonds. A federal judge granted preliminary approval to a nearly $360 million settlement, resolving nationwide antitrust claims that property firms, including Greystar, Lincoln Property Company, and Camden Property Trust, used RealPage's software to coordinate rent pricing across the country. The settlement creates a $359.9 million fund for tenants who paid rent at affected properties between October 2018 and November 2025. The companies admit no wrongdoing, which is standard, but they are required to overhaul how they handle competitively sensitive leasing data going forward. Whatever they were doing with that data, they are contractually obligated to stop describing it the same way. Canada made good on its threat, formally publishing a list of nearly 900 American products that will face new tariffs starting September 8th, after last week's collapse of trade talks with Washington. Ottawa is matching the United States dollar for dollar with duties of 25 to 50% on steel, aluminum, appliances, cosmetics, and agricultural equipment. It is a serious escalation of a trade war that has already frozen a fair amount of cross-border commerce. President Trump's response was to float renaming Lake Ontario to Lake America, telling social media the United States does not expect to do much business with Canada's most populous province anymore, apparently unaware that Ontario is a province and Lake Ontario is a lake. Credit card delinquencies, meanwhile, are improving. The 30-day delinquency rate on bank-issued credit cards fell to 2.85% in the second quarter, its lowest level since early 2023, and the broader 60-day rate dropped to 2.69%. The New York Fed clarified that last year's alarming spike in 90-day delinquencies was largely a statistical mirage, caused by banks keeping older, charged-off debt on credit reports longer than they used to. For prime-rated cardholders specifically, the 60-day rate has fallen to 0.84%, below pre-pandemic norms. It is reassuring to know the crisis was mostly a filing error. New home prices are moving the other direction. The median price of a new single-family home dropped to $393,800 in July, the lowest mark since September 2021, as builders sit on a growing backlog of unsold inventory. Census data put total new home supply at 495,000 units, a fourth straight monthly increase, while sales fell nearly 6% from a year earlier. Builders like D.R. Horton and Lennar are cutting base prices and absorbing the cost of buying down buyers' mortgage rates just to keep contracts moving. Even with those incentives eating into their margins, sales kept sliding, leaving near-record surpluses across the South and Midwest. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is facing sharp criticism from Wall Street after a surprise bond buying maneuver aimed at pushing down climbing long-term interest rates. The intervention produced a brief rally that faded almost immediately once traders started asking why the Treasury felt the need to manipulate debt markets during a period of relative calm. Billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller, who once mentored Bessent, publicly called the move a dangerous mistake that damages the credibility of United States debt itself. Analysts warn that papering over the symptoms of a $40 trillion national debt could eventually push borrowing costs higher still by removing the market pressure that used to discourage this sort of spending in the first place. I have opinions about artificially suppressed interest rates, most of them longer than this newsletter, and I will simply note that the market's response to a rate suppression stunt was, unhelpfully, to keep behaving like a market. The rest of the world offered less arithmetic and more grief. Dolly Parton died peacefully at her home in Nashville on Tuesday, following a brief battle with cancer at the age of 80. Born into rural poverty in East Tennessee, she wrote more than 3,000 songs over her career, including Jolene, 9 to 5, and I Will Always Love You. She won 11 Grammy Awards, sold more than 100 million records, and unlike most of the industry's women, kept ownership of her own publishing catalog. She spent much of that fortune on charity, most notably founding the Imagination Library, inspired by her father's inability to read, which has mailed more than 300 million free books to children around the world. At least 47 people were killed and more than 50 others abducted when gang fighters swept through the Haitian town of Kenskoff in one of the largest mass kidnappings the country has seen in years. Fighters from the Vive Ansanam coalition, recently designated a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, executed residents and set homes and a local church on fire, all within a short distance of the regional police precinct. Residents have directed their outrage squarely at those police, who did not intervene during the attack. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres condemned the massacre and warned that the coalition's growing control threatens Haiti's fragile hope of holding its first general election in more than a decade. A fire tore through the neonatal intensive care unit at the Pakistan Institute of Medical Sciences in Islamabad, killing 14 newborns after an air conditioning compressor exploded on the ward's third floor. Firefighters had to climb ladders and smash through windows to reach the trapped infants. Only one of the 15 babies in the unit was pulled out alive, rescued by a doctor before the fire consumed the room. The hospital is one of the capital's largest government-run facilities, and grieving families are demanding answers about its outdated electrical wiring and inadequate firefighting equipment. Pakistan's Prime Minister has already dismissed the country's top health ministry official. A federal appeals court ruled that political parties and joint fundraising committees are not legally entitled to the steeply discounted television ad rates reserved for individual candidates. The Fourth Circuit's 2-1 decision strikes down a Federal Communications Commission memo that had let parties access those cheaper rates when spending was coordinated directly with a campaign. The ruling is a real setback for the Republican National Committee, which had planned to use its financial edge to flood the airwaves at the discount tier following a Supreme Court decision allowing unlimited coordinated party spending. With the discount window normally opening 60 days before the midterms, Republicans are expected to appeal immediately to salvage what is left of their fall media plan. Sticking with the vote itself, election officials nationwide confirmed that mail-in voting will proceed uninterrupted for the November midterms, following up on the Supreme Court's recent decision to temporarily lift an injunction against President Trump's executive order. The 6-3 procedural ruling lets the administration's citizenship verification directives move forward, but a separate injunction still blocks the Postal Service from implementing any new delivery restrictions. Officials in the 8 states that vote entirely by mail said ballots are already scheduled for distribution, and making logistical changes this close to Election Day simply is not possible anymore. The court's unsigned opinion made a point of noting the ruling only cleared a procedural hurdle, and that any actual attempt to enforce the order could still be struck down as unlawful. And Alaska's Senate race will indeed feature 2 candidates named Dan Sullivan on the same ballot, realizing a fear Republicans have apparently been nursing for a while. Incumbent Senator Dan S. Sullivan faces Dan J. Sullivan, a former schoolteacher and first-time candidate who earned enough votes in the state's all-party primary to advance. The incumbent has accused Democratic operatives of recruiting his own namesake specifically to split the conservative vote and help Democrat Mary Peltola flip the seat. The state elections director tried to disqualify the challenger outright, and the National Republican Senatorial Committee pushed hard against his candidacy, but the Alaska Supreme Court ordered him onto the ballot anyway. Ranked choice voting was designed to handle a lot of scenarios. 2 men with the same name was apparently not one of them. I keep returning to the president's idea of renaming Lake Ontario to Lake America, because unlike most policy proposals this week, I can actually picture this one through to completion. Lake Erie becomes Lake Freedom. Lake Michigan becomes Lake Number 1. Lake Superior presumably gets renamed Lake Actually the Best One, we checked. Eventually, somebody points out that Canada still owns half of Lake Ontario, and the negotiations to rename their half become their own multi-year trade dispute, with retaliatory tariffs on maple syrup and a strongly worded letter about cartography. I called my landlord this morning to ask if I could rename my apartment building. He said no. I am choosing to interpret that as a jurisdictional issue rather than a personal one. Pflugerville's newly disconnected license plate readers are, as of this morning, still bolted to their poles around town, quietly pointed at traffic and doing absolutely nothing with what they see. That is the lot for today. I am Lambert Woollingham, and I will be filing this one under settled, in the loosest possible sense of the word. The day has been shorn. Until tomorrow.